Hey, what's up guys? Thanks for stopping by the channel. So for this video, I'm going to give you a head-to-head comparison between what I consider two of the best mid-tier German Flieger watches on the market. On the left-hand side is my Damasko DA47 white dial, and this dial is fully loomed. And that's going to be compared against my white dial Sinn 104. Now these watches are very comparable across multiple criteria, which I've listed here on the left hand side. Each criteria is going to be graded from 1 to 10, and at the end of the video you'll just be able to tally up the score and see if one pulled away from the other timepiece with overall everyday wear potential. But I will mention right off the bat, guys, you really can't go wrong with either timepiece. They're both phenomenal pilot watches. So let me just hold up both watches side by side when we discuss the first point, which is the case dimensions and design features of both watches. Now I think you can both see very similar in dimensions. They're both approximately 41 millimeters across the case. Now if I flip to the side, you can see a very similar side profile as well. Case thickness, both around 12 millimeters, although the Sinn is slightly thinner, and lug to lug is close to about 47 on the Sinn, and really more like a 48 on the Damasko on the left. And you can see the Damasko also has drilled lug apertures for quick strap changing options. Now side by side, I think with the dial, Damasko went the more traditional German Flieger route with the bold Arabics printed for the hour markings and the triangle at the 12 for orientation. And the Sinn, I think, just went a little more vintage styling with the simple batons for the hour markings and the more of a syringe style hand stack there. Both watches have a very useful day and date complication near the 3 o'clock position. Both also say made in Germany near the 6. And outboard of a dial, both have bidirectional 60-click bezels with ceramic bearings, and the bezel action on both watches is phenomenal for the price point. Although it is worth noting the differences on the printing of the bezels. On the left of Damasko, you have your elapsed time that starts at 0, and then from clockwise it goes all the way to 60. And then you can see on the Sinn, the numbers are printed in reverse, so it's a countdown timer where you have 60 at the start, going clockwise, and then it counts down all the way to 0. Now, if there is one watch that pulls away from the other with respect to design, I think I'd give it to the Sinn ever so slightly. I just think that the case finishing is a little bit better. It's more angular. You can see there's polished bevels. In fact, the case is completely polished. And I just find it's a little more elegant, even with the printing being in cursive and that dial having a very clean white, almost enamel color, versus the Damasko, which is definitely more of a tool watch design. It's a little more austere. You can see there's really no detail on case finishing. It's purely a bead blasted finish. But this case is ice hardened, which is Damasko's process of making it basically scratch proof and corrosion resistant. And I'll discuss that more in the durability side. So if I had to rank the case and design of both watches, I do think that the Sinn pulls away ever so slightly, so I'll give it a 9 out of 10. And the Damasko is just definitely more the tool watch. It's really well designed as well, but I'll give it the 8 out of 10. As far as movements go, it's nice to see that both German manufacturers use workhorse Swiss automatic movements. So starting with the Damasko, this comes in with the ETA 2836-2 in a Laborer grade, which it's basically the more decorated of that grade of movement. Although you're not going to see the decoration on the case back, it's a closed case back and screwed down. But it's nice that they didn't go with a basic movement. So with ETA, you're getting that 4 Hertz sweep on the seconds hand there. You have about a 38-hour power reserve. It's hacking in hand wind, and it's about 25 joules on this movement. Now if we move over to the Sinn, they're basically using the Sellita equivalent of the ETA 2836. They're using a Sellita SW200-1, which again, it's basically the off-brand ETA version that Sellita used. It's a copy of that movement. It does have one more joule, I think. It's 26 joule. Similar function, similar power reserve. Although I do believe that Sinn uses a top grade Sellita. And anecdotally, this watch keeps amazing time, only differing by about a second per day. Whereas the Damasko tends to pick up about 8 or 9 seconds a day, which is a little more than I would have hoped. At the end of the day, though, these are both workhorse Swiss movements. I've had no issues with either of them. So for me personally, I can't differentiate between the two. They both get 9s out of 10. Although I know some people will argue that the ETA is better than the Sellita or vice versa. Now let's talk about the strap options for both timepieces. Because I wanted to keep this comparison as apples to apples as possible, I'm rating them both on the supplied strap. Both you can get bracelet options for, but to keep the price points the same. The Damasko strap, I think, does come out a little bit ahead of the Sinn. They went with the more traditional pilot style strap, which kind of flares out past the lugs and then tapers very nicely. The stitching on it is excellent on the top side. On the underside, it's padded very well, and they even have this extra flap that prevents the buckle itself from contacting directly with your wrist and causing discomfort, which is a nice feature. And the other noteworthy thing with the Damasko buckle is that it's finished the same and it uses the same ice-hardened steel as the head of the watch. So no corners were cut with making the buckle or the strap for the Damasko. In comparison, the Sinn strap is definitely much thicker. It's more bolstered leather. It doesn't taper at all, I believe. This is pretty much 20 millimeters at the lugs to the end of the buckle. The buckle is done in high polished stainless steel, just like the case of the Sinn, so very consistent in both watches here. The underside I find is a little coarser compared to the Damasko, and this leather strap takes in a little bit more break-in time because it is a little bit thicker. So not a bad strap at all. But if I am going to rate them side by side, I just think out of the gate, the Damasko has an amazing strap and pin buckle, so it gets a 9 out of 10. And the Sinn by no means is a bad strap. It's just a little more generic, and it doesn't have as many features as the Damasko, so it gets a 7 out of 10. Now from a durability perspective, both watches have that typical German over-engineering, which I love to see. So advantages for Damasko, though, is that they have a really good anti-shock system in place, not just for the movement, but for preventing impacts against the crown from traveling into the movements. They have lots of patents, and I'm not going to go through an exhaustive list, but that just helps with the overall durability in case you drop the watch. And then the standout durability feature is, of course, the ice-hardened case, which doesn't pick up any scratches at all. You can see over the few months I've owned this timepiece, it looks like it just came from the factory. Additionally, when we're talking about the bezel and the insert itself, the side of the bezel is the same ice-hardened steel that won't scratch, and the bezel insert has been hardened using their Damask coating system, so it's much harder to scratch than the case and bezel insert on the Sinn, so I just think it can stand up to more day-to-day punishment. Other durability features, this does have a screw-down crown, so you get 100 meters water resistance, which isn't as high as the Sinn, and I'll discuss that in a second. It does have the closed and screwed-in case back, so I just think it will be really tough and a little more anti-magnetic than the Sinn, which has the display case back, and I'll show you that in a second. Now with the Sinn, for durability, I mean it does outcompete the Damasko in some categories, but in a general sense, I do worry that the case being 316L stainless steel and high polish, it doesn't really hide the scratches that well. I think you can see some hairline scratches at the bottom of the lugs where I swapped out the strap. You can see the sapphire display back, which it really shows off the really nice finishing they've done on the Sellita SW200 movement. But at the same time, I guess there's a small risk that the sapphire could shatter if you drop it. but it does take some advantages, as I mentioned. Starting with water resistance, this watch has 200 meters water resistance. I mean, you could basically take this diving like a diver, which is phenomenal. Other advantages, the bezel is what they call a captive bezel insert because there's screws fixing the bezel into place. It won't pop off with friction, which is a great feature to have on this type of watch. And this watch is also low pressure resistant. But if I had to pick one over the other for durability, I just like the grab and go potential of a Damasko a little bit better, just with the case being pretty much scratch and corrosion free, as well as the bezel insert. So it gets a 10 out of 10. Now the Sinn, again, does best it in certain features, but overall, just with the all polished case, I do kind of worry about it taking more of a beating over time, so it gets a 9 out of 10. The next parameter we're going to look at is quality. And I think both of these watches just fire on all cylinders when it comes to quality. I mean, if you just look at the quality of the sapphire crystals, they're both amazing. They both have 2 layers of anti-reflective treatment, one on the top side, one on the bottom side of the crystal, and it's really hard to see any reflections. The printing on both watches is extremely crisp, and aiding in the legibility, the lume on both watches is phenomenal. I'll actually throw up a head-to-head lume comparison now, just so you can see exactly what I'm talking about. You know, if you're just looking for pure potency and surface area, the Damasko will best the Sinn. But don't count the Sinn out, because I do appreciate that the Sinn has a really nice lumed triangle on the bezel pip, as opposed to just like a luminous pearl on the Damasko. So at the end of the day, both have a really, really nice application of superluminova applied to the dial. And again, the quality of the case design and bezel on both are just spectacular. So in the quality department, I don't think I can separate the two here. Both get solid 9s out of 10. So the next parameter is style, and I think that's a fairly subjective parameter. I do feel like pilot watches in general are worn more casually, and for purpose-driven people that just want extreme legibility, you can't really always dress them up or, make them go with different attire. But at the end of the day, I do think they have really good takes on both. With the Damasko here, again, more of a tool watch aesthetic, but it's not just like a copy of every Flieger watch out there. They do have the printing for their logo and the date aperture slightly offset at the 3 o'clock position. And the Sinn, I just think it just gives a little more nostalgic, more of an elegant vintage vibe. And again, it's not just your typical pilot watch in general. But again, at the end of the day, from my personal style perspective, I can't separate the two either. You know, for what they are as purpose-driven pilot watches, they both get 8s out of 10. The next category is performance. And I'm going to start with the Sinn this time. I've owned this watch for over a year now, which is much longer than I've owned the Damasko, and it's always performed extremely well. Again, it's always kept excellent time, and I have given it some abuse over the years. You know, it's been in the water, it's been with me when I've been active, and it's a really strong performer, so no complaints with the Sinn at all. And now for the Damasko. Whilst I've only had this for about 2 months, I've had numerous other Damaskos in the past, and they all function relatively the same. I mean, their case design is pretty much always the same ice-hardened steel. The movements are always the Labrador ETA grades. And I feel like it's been a solid performer as well. I've definitely worn this in harsher conditions than I've worn the Sinn. And again, no real signs of use or wear from this watch so far. So if I'm going to rate both, I mean, this does sound a little bit redundant, but personally, I really can't separate the two when it comes to performance. They both haven't let me down, both getting a 9 out of 10. Now, as we get to the end, we're going to talk about versatility, and this is where I think the Sinn probably pulls away slightly more. I just think that the overall case finishing and the dial design, it lends itself to being a little more versatile if you need to dress this up. You could probably put it on a fancy leather strap, or you can probably put it on a bracelet with some fine polishing to match the case, and it would look pretty smart. Conversely, I do think it's kind of hard to dress up the Damasko. It's definitely more of a casual watch. I mean, there's really no additional finishes or bevels or details on the case. It's just a no-nonsense Thule timepiece. So if you had to pick one for versatility, I'm going to give the edge to the Sinn. It gets an 8 out of 10, and the Damasko slightly behind it at 7 out of 10. Okay, then we get into the value category. And I mean, anytime you buy a new timepiece, right, there's always a value proposition to be had, I do believe. Both these watches on their strap configurations come in between that $1,300 to $1,400 US price range if you buy from North American authorized dealers. And at that price, you're getting some really amazing over-engineered German features, and I really feel the quality shines through for both timepieces. So for the sub $2,000 price range, both of them are amazing value for money. Both get a strong 9 out of 10. And the last category I'll mention before wrapping this up is just the brand equity or brand name recognition. In the past, I did think Damasko followed a little bit behind of Sinn here. They got their start as mostly a case manufacturer, doing everything in-house. In fact, they used to supply cases to Sinn during the early 2000s, and they haven't been around as long as Sinn, but they've really upped their game. Their catalog's expanding, they're working on in-house movements, so I think they've caught up to Sinn, which is, I mean, Sinn's been around for, I think, since the mid-60s, and the founder was a pilot himself from Germany, so I do think there's a little bit more of a heritage there, and the overall value retention might be slightly higher on Sinn, but that gap is closing. Personally, for me, I really can't separate the two either. Both get 8s out of 10. I think if you're a watch enthusiast, you'll know the brand, but it doesn't have the same cachet as like Rolex or Omega, which is totally fine because sometimes you just, want to wear an understated watch. So if you tally up both the scores, does one pull ahead of the other? Well, at the end of the day, the slight edge, in my opinion, for this Duel goes to the Damasko. I just tend to lean towards wearing this watch more, in a grab-and-go environment where I don't need to worry about scratching up the case, when legibility is extreme with the full lume dial. But again, I think if you want to lean into something that's just a little more versatile, has a little more vintage styling, a little more nostalgic, and it doesn't scream tool watch as much, then the Sinn 104 is probably the way to go for you. But guys, as always, I love to see your comments in the description of this video. Please let me know your feedback. If you only had to pick one of these guys, would you go for Damasko or would you go with the Sinn? If you like this content, please consider subscribing, and as always, I'll catch you guys in the next video.